It is clear from the pandemic that there has been a war against small business. It is clear from the Biden tax proposals that there is a continuing war on small business. But we have literally the expert on the war in small business, Carol Roth, who literally wrote the book, The War on Small Business. It's very clear that the pandemic was all about big business won, small business lost. But in your discussions, in your articles, in your book, you talk about this started a long time ago.
I sort of look at a spectrum of economic freedom. And on one side, you have traditional free market capitalism, which is freedom, choice, transparency, and it's protected by the guardrails of the protection of individual rights, including property rights. On the other side of the spectrum, you have what I call central planning. And I use central planning to talk about a handful of people making decisions on behest of a whole bunch of people and usually using force, coercion, and control to do so. And I use that phrase instead of socialism or communism or pretty socialism or like whatever it is, because I don't want to get caught up in the definitions. I want to say very conceptual. And so if you look back, particularly over, I don't know, the last maybe 40 years, there has been a concerted effort to grow the force and control and the planning piece of what we have going on in the economy and have less of it, in terms of the freedom and choice. So if you look at where the economy sat going into 2019, it was split down the middle. 30.2 million decentralized, free market-esque small businesses who represented about half of the GDP and about half of the employment, but 99.9% of all business entities. And then you have half the economy concentrated in about 10 to 15,000 big businesses who also had about half the economy and half the employment. So you can already kind of see, okay, well, we've got all these people over here and they're decentralized, but if we want the power, we need to be focused on these guys that are easier to control, that have the money, the lobbying dollars. So if you look back on, the interactions and intervention in the public markets by the Federal Reserve, if you look at the government and the way they brought in China as a trading partner to something that was supposed to be capitalism, but had communists who didn't value intellectual property rights. They don't value any rights, right? Human rights. As our partner, if you look at the growth in government spending before COVID, at all three levels of government, it was upwards of $8.1 trillion. I mean, that number is just staggering. If you look at the number of laws that have been passed, you look at all of these things, that central power side has gotten bigger, and with so has come the war on that part that's decentralized.
You mentioned in your writing that you even believe that the PPP loans was an attack on small business. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back to the concept that we were not all locked down. If everybody, we just kind of discussed it, right? There were all of these places, the Amazon warehouse, Costco, as you mentioned, that were not locked down. So we didn't have lockdowns. We had these targeted lockdowns that primarily affected small businesses. And instead of giving them due compensation, which is required under the Constitution, if the government takes your property for the public good and shutting it down for a health concern, is taking it for the public good, they owe you appropriate compensation. But if you looked at how much money was given out both in the first tranche of PPP under the CARES Act and just in total, I mean, it was crumbs compared to the actual reality of the situation. And it was structured in such a way that it actually didn't get to the vulnerable businesses, especially during that first tranche. The supply, which was, a couple $100 billion out of the multiple trillions that were spent, and over the multiple tranches, still less than $1 trillion out of the $6+ trillion that were spent. It was structured so you could take down millions and millions of dollars under PPP. Well, like if you could take down that kind of money, you have other access to capital in other ways. You don't need a PPP loan. But if you are a hairdresser or a dry cleaner or a gym or whatnot, like you probably do, they didn't even get in line because the banks obviously service those customers who were their best customers, which were these big companies. But the long tail effects, we can see that in the numbers, is that we have 9.2 million jobs that are unfilled in this country. This is more than we had before the pandemic started in February 2020, and we can't get people back to work. And then that and other impacts of just turning off a large swath of the economy and thinking you could turn it back on like you were power cycling a computer modem has disrupted supply chains.
Right.
And then if you think about the long-term effects, like from a small business owner's perspective, so you're a restaurant, you were shut down and pulled apart, you barely hung on, maybe you got some PPP crumbs, you finally can open up again. You can't find workers. So now you as the owner is probably like bussing tables, like being the hostess, taking reservations, cooking the food, doing the stuff. Your customers who are like dying to come in, they have bad service because you don't have enough people to work there, and they're never going to come back and see you again.
Let me ask you this question. Why? Why do you think it is that the government is doing this? Because when we look at it's really clear in the pandemic, and it's very clear, we'll get to this, it's very clear in the Biden tax proposals that this is a very big swing from focusing and giving benefits to small business to benefiting the big guys. Why do you think that's going on?
Again, it's conditioning people to devalue the dignity of work and to think that the government's going to take care of you. And if you're the government who already has an incredible amount of power, like what's the next step into getting more power? It's more things under your purview. UBI is a clear one of that. So if you don't know UBI, it's universal basic income. It's when the government, who doesn't make anything of value, decides that it's going to promise you somebody else's money for the future, including your own. So it's like a shell game. You give the government $1 and they'll give you back 80 cents guaranteed or something like that. I don't care about the intention. I don't care if you think that small businesses are too small to matter. I don't care if you think that they're too hard to control, but they stand in the way of that political power grab. And so the intentions don't matter, it's the outcomes that matter. And when you have this big behemoth that is like continuing to increase its purview, that's the outcome that's going to happen.
Joe Biden has said from the day one when he first started running, he is a union guy.
Yes.
How much of this do you think is coming from the Biden administration, given that small businesses don't get unionized? Only big businesses get unionized. Do you think that there's a correlation there?
So, I try to be fair and nonpartisan about this. I think it's a systemic issue, and I think that it predates the Biden administration, but
Right.
There's no doubt that the Biden administration's policy are big special interests and big business oriented. And that is sort of the unholy triumvirate, right? It's central planners in government, it's big business, and it's big special interest. And if you look at all of the policies that are coming out of that administration, it does. It benefits the big businesses. It benefits the unions because obviously, like you said, it's much easier to unionize on a big business side than it is on a small business side. It stifles innovation. So if you look at the PRO Act, if you look at even the capital gains increases, like any of these things, the minimum wage increases, any of these policies really do have the direct impact of being anti-competitive and putting up more barriers for small businesses to start and to continue to operate and to continue to compete and to consolidate more and more power with big businesses, big special interests in government.
The current Biden tax proposals are so big that they would, if they were enacted, they would be the biggest change in tax policy since 1913 in the United States. We actually calculated if you're in California and you built a business from scratch and it was worth $100 million under the current proposals, out of that $100 million, your children would inherit roughly $8 million. The government would take $92 million.
We see this over and over again because, everything sounds like it's coming down on the big guy, but they never are the ones that get hurt by this. They always have these different sort of ins and outs, and it's always the small business. And I'll offer sort of a bigger macro consequence and just something like, the traditional capital gains rate, if that's increased. Obviously, we've seen the Federal Reserve disrupt risk in the market in terms of decreasing interest rates, and there are all sorts of implications, like we're talking here, that end up benefiting the big business. But if you start disrupting the risk on the capital gains side, then it means that you have to take on more risk in order to earn the same returns. And if you're somebody who has a lot of wealth, you're either going to hold on to that or you're going to risk adjust for that. So in that scenario, whether there's less capital or more, less of an appetite for risk, who ends up being the riskiest bets? It's the startups and the small businesses.
Let's take the simple example of, Jeff Bezos has been talking about, we can increase the corporate tax rate, et cetera. At the same time, he's lobbying for research and development tax credits, right? So what we know is that it's not the tax rate that matters, it's the tax you pay that matters. And, if you can get the tax incentives, who cares what the tax rate is? I mean, frankly, if your taxable income is zero, your tax rate doesn't matter. Let me ask you a question though, Carol. What can we do about this? I mean, what can the small business owner do? What can people do outside of writing their senators, which I hope they, if like me in Arizona, where we have Democrats in the Senate, we can write our senators. But outside of that side of it, which has maybe some small impact, what can we actually do?
I think from a consumer standpoint, the easiest thing that you can do to help counteract this is to vote with your dollars. I saw a statistic the other day that Amazon is planning to capture 85% of the digital back to school shopping. Well, if you're shopping for back to school, maybe shop somewhere else. And again, I'm a capitalist. So if you find value in Amazon and it's just unbeatable, go ahead. I have nothing against them, as a company, but you have to remember that your dollars and you're voting with your dollars is part of capitalism. And so if you want this decentralization and this balance of power, and you want to support the wealth creation opportunities for a small business owner, perhaps consider supporting a small business. In terms of the government stuff, yes, you have to stand up and you have to write in on all of these things that sound good in theory, but are anti-competitive to small business. And one of the things that I talk about in the book that I think is really important, and unfortunately nobody talks about it because it is so difficult and opaque, is the Federal Reserve. I mean, so much of the transfer of wealth and so much of the tipping of scale has come out of the monetary policy in this country, to the point where it's mind-boggling, and it's in the trillions and trillions of dollars, that we need to have a concerted effort to rein in the Federal Reserve and put guardrails about, how much intervention they can do into the market. I mean, I think the other thing too, that we need more legal challenges, and there are some great organizations. Pacific Legal is one of them. And, there are foundations that are going to be challenging these things. So like you said, in the Constitution, it says you can't do this differently. So let's go out and challenge these things so that we stop getting these rights stomping regulations and mandates that are put out there. And I've been encouraging small business owners that if they feel like their property was taken for the public good and they did not get their eminent domain appropriate compensation, they should go out and sue.
That would be an interesting class action, wouldn't it?
I think you'll see it.
I think what we learned from GameStop and AMC, et cetera, is that the small investor can have an impact if we get together and have the impact together.
So, amen.
Carol Roth, thank you so much for joining us. The book is The War on Small Business. Highly encourage everybody, pay attention to this. This is an all-out war, and it's not going to end pretty. Okay, if we're not diligent, we don't get the financial education, we don't learn these things, it is not going to be pretty, because what would the United States look like if we had no small business? By the way, if we had no small business, we'd have no Amazon, we'd have no Tesla. Just remind everybody, we'd have no Walmart, because they all started as small businesses. So sometimes I think they forget that that's how they started. And we just need to remember that really this country is all about small business. When we get financially educated, then we're aware of these things. We can start looking at things that we can do. We can get a team around us. We can get advisors around us. And when we do that, we're always going to make way more money and pay way less tax. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the WealthAbility Show with Tom Wheelwright. Way more money, way less taxes. To learn more, go to wealthability.com.